Sometimes a man finds that there is no choice when he thinks he still has one. Dust dances in the warm afternoon air, and each grain seems to carry the weight of every decision that has ever been made without permission. Billy was standing on the porch of the police station when Sheriff Matthews came out with that smile that didn't reach his eyes. The sun beat down the wooden planks of Main Street, making the air tremble like water on hot stones. It was a day like any other in Cedar Falls, until it wasn't. The sheriff tapped his boots on the wood, brushing off the red dust that stuck to everything in that town, his small dark eyes fixed on Billy with an intensity that made the young man retreat half a step. Matthews adjusted the badge on his broad chest before starting to talk about Victoria Hartwell, the 40-year-old widow who owned half of the land around the city. The woman who had been alone for 3 months and needed a husband to take care of her business. Matthews spoke as if he were discussing the weather, but Billy felt the sweat run down his back. It wasn't just because of the heat. The sheriff walked to the edge of the porch, taking in the empty street. A wagon passed slowly, its wheels kicking up small clouds of dry land. The silence stretched like a rope about to break as Matthews explained the plans already arranged for the wedding the following Saturday. Billy felt the ground move under his feet. Victoria Hartwell was known throughout the county. Rich, beautiful, but there were stories about her. Stories that people told in low voices when they thought no one was listening. Stories about the 2 previous husbands who died under strange circumstances. Billy's refusal came out weaker than he had intended. Matthews turned slowly, like a predator that had just found its prey. The smile returned to her lips, but now it looked more like a threat. It was then that the sheriff mentioned the marked cards in Jameson's saloon. Billy felt his blood run cold. How did Matthews know that? It had been only once when he was desperate for money. No one had seen it. No one should know. But the sheriff was talking about 3 witnesses, about how the townspeople treated cheaters in the game. Billy knew the stories. Men who had been driven out of the city in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Others that simply disappeared. Cedar Falls had its own way of dealing with those who broke the unwritten rules. Matthews informed him of the visit scheduled for the next day at 3 in the afternoon. Billy was supposed to talk to Victoria about the details of the wedding. The sheriff was clear about not letting Mrs. Hartwell down, explaining that she didn't like being let down. The threat hung in the air like the heat of the desert. The door to the police station closed with a dry noise, leaving Billy alone on the porch. He looked at the empty street, at the houses he had known since he was a child, at the life that was about to change forever. The sheriff had used careful words, but the message was clear: marry Victoria Hartwell or face the consequences of the cheating charge. The wind blew again, carrying the smell of dry earth and something else, something that smelled of secrets buried under the desert sun. Billy took a deep breath and walked down the steps of the police station, knowing he had until the next day to figure out what kind of trap he was about to fall into. Deep in her chest, a small voice whispered that Victoria Hartwell held secrets that could be far more dangerous than any accusation of cheating in the game. 2 deaths in the family in less than 5 years were no coincidence in a city where nothing happened by chance. Billy walked down Main Street, feeling the invisible eyes of the neighbors through the curtains. Everyone knew, everyone always knew when something was about to happen in Cedar Falls. The dust kept dancing in the warm air, and each grain seemed to tell a different story about what awaited him in the big white house at the end of Main Street. The sun began to tilt westward, painting the sky red as blood. Billy had 18 hours to figure out what his fate would be: an arranged marriage or a forced exile. Perhaps there was no difference between the 2 options. The morning came like a ruthless judge, bringing with it the weight of decisions that could no longer be postponed. Billy woke up with the bitter taste of fear in his mouth and the certainty that his life had changed during the night, even though he still didn't know exactly how. The clock on the wall of the boarding house where he lived struck 2:15 in the afternoon when Billy finally decided to walk to Victoria Hartwell's house. His boots made too much noise on the wooden floor, as if the whole world could hear his hesitant footsteps toward the destination Sheriff Matthews had chosen for him. The Hartwell house was at the end of Main Street, a two-story white-painted building that stood out among the other simpler houses in the city. The front yard was well tended, with flowers that could grow even in the punishing desert sun. Billy stopped at the wrought iron gate, watching the windows of the house, as if they could reveal the secrets that were hidden behind the lace curtains. Victoria appeared on the porch before Billy even knocked on the door. She wore a dark blue dress that highlighted her light eyes, and her brown hair was tied up in an elegant bun. At 40, she was still a beautiful woman, but there was something about her gaze that made Billy feel like prey, being watched by an experienced predator. She descended the steps of the balcony with the grace of someone who was used to being watched and admired. Her gloved hands moved gently, but Billy noticed how she kept her fists clenched, as if she was holding something invisible too tightly. Victoria invited him in with a gesture that did not admit refusal. The room was decorated with expensive furniture brought from the East, Persian rugs, and pictures in gilded frames. Billy had never been in such an elegant house, and he felt out of place among so many valuable objects. The smell of lavender mixed with something heavier hung in the air. They sat in leather armchairs that creaked under the weight of their bodies. Victoria poured tea in fine porcelain cups, her movements precise and calculated. Billy watched her hands as she handled the delicate dishes, noticing a small scar on his right index finger. An almost invisible mark, but one that caught his attention for some reason he couldn't explain. The conversation began with formalities about marriage. Victoria talked about the ceremony, about the guests, about the preparations, as if she were discussing the details of any party. But Billy could see the tension in her voice, the way she avoided looking directly into his eyes for too long. It was when Victoria mentioned their previous husbands that Billy felt a shiver run down his spine. She spoke of them with a coldness that contrasted with the melancholy tone she used to describe their deaths. The first, James, had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1872. The second, Robert, had had an accident with his horse last fall. Billy noticed how Victoria unconsciously touched a cross-shaped pin she wore on her chest every time she mentioned the death of one of her husbands. A small gesture, almost imperceptible, but one that revealed more than his carefully chosen words. The house was too quiet. Billy realized that there were no servants, no noise of domestic activity. Victoria seemed to live alone in that large house, surrounded by memories and secrets that weighed in the air like the humidity before a desert storm. When Victoria got up to get more tea, Billy took the opportunity to take a closer look at the room. There were two photographs on the mantelpiece, both showing Victoria standing next to different men. In both portraits, she smiled, but her eyes kept the same cold expression that Billy saw now. The men in the photographs looked happy, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Victoria returned carrying a silver tray of homemade cookies. Billy noticed that she had changed her gloves, now wearing a pair of brown leather instead of the white lace ones. The change seemed strange, for no apparent reason. She offered the cookies with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, insisting that Billy try her special recipe. The taste was too sweet, with a bitter aftertaste that stuck to the tongue. Billy drank the tea quickly, trying to get the strange taste out of his mouth. Victoria watched him intently, as if she was expecting some specific reaction. Her eyes shone with an intensity that made Billy feel uncomfortable. The afternoon was inching in when Victoria finally touched on the subject that really mattered. She talked about the property, about the cattle, about the businesses that needed a man to manage. Her voice carried a natural authority, but Billy noticed the gaps in what she didn't say. There were parts of the story that were left out, important details carefully omitted. Billy left the Hartwell home with more questions than answers. The sun was setting, painting the sky with orange tones that resembled fire. He walked slowly back to the boarding house, feeling the weight of Victoria's gaze on his back until he rounded the corner. That night, Billy couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the strange taste of the cookies, the scar on Victoria's finger, the absence of servants in the big house, small details that alone meant nothing, but together formed a disturbing pattern. The wedding was scheduled for 4 days later. Billy had little time to figure out what he was getting into, but one certainty grew in his chest like a poisonous seed. Victoria Hartwell was hiding something far more dangerous than Sheriff Matthews had imagined. The truth always finds a way to reveal itself, even when it is buried under layers of carefully constructed lies. Billy found out about it the next morning when old Doc Harrison showed up at the boarding house with a grave expression on his wrinkled face. The town doctor rarely left his office before noon, but here he was, at 7 in the morning, knocking on Billy's bedroom door with the urgency of someone carrying a heavy conscience. Doc Harrison was a man of few smiles and many secrets, someone who had seen half the population of Cedar Falls born and died. Billy found him sitting on the porch of the boarding house, smoking a cigarette with slightly shaking hands. The doctor seemed to have aged 10 years since Billy had last seen him, as if the weight of some terrible knowledge was consuming his strength. His clothes were rumpled, as if he had been awake all night. Doc Harrison spoke quietly about Victoria Hartwell's 2 husbands. James, the first, had indeed died of pneumonia, but his words carried nuances that Billy hadn't noticed before. The disease had arrived in a strange way, at a time of year when pneumonia was rare. James was a healthy, strong man with no history of respiratory problems. Robert, the second husband, had an even more intriguing case. The horse accident had happened on a calm morning with an animal that Robert had ridden for years without any problems. The doctor described the injuries in a way that made Billy feel butterflies in his stomach. Injuries that did not exactly match a fall from a horse. The old doctor put out his cigarette on the wooden floor of the porch and looked Billy in the eye for the first time since he had started talking. There was fear in that look, but also relief, as if he was finally sharing a burden he had carried alone for too long. Doc Harrison mentioned other details that had gone unnoticed at the time. Victoria always showed up at the office a few days before her husband's deaths, asking about specific symptoms, about medicines, about doses. Innocent questions on the surface, but which took on an ominous meaning when seen in retrospect. Billy felt the world swirl around when the doctor talked about arsenic, a substance that could be easily found, used to kill rats and other pests. In small doses, it caused symptoms that could be mistaken for various diseases. Doc Harrison explained how the venom acted in the body, how it masked its presence behind seemingly natural symptoms. The doctor got up to leave, but before leaving, he handed Billy a small, dark glass vial. Inside was a clear liquid that smelled faintly of bitter almonds. An improvised antidote, Doc Harrison explained, something that could help if Billy found himself in a desperate situation. Billy spent the rest of the morning walking the streets of Cedar Falls, trying to process what he had discovered. The city looked different now, as if he was seeing everything through a new lens. People greeted Victoria respectfully as she passed, but Billy noticed how they avoided looking directly at her for too long. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Victoria showed up at the boarding house carrying a basket of homemade food. She explained that she had prepared some special dishes for Billy to try, a family tradition she wanted to share with her future husband. His voice sounded sweet and thoughtful, but Billy now realized the falsehood behind the carefully chosen words. They sat in the common room of the boarding house, under the curious gaze of the other guests. Victoria served slices of apple pie, pieces of roasted chicken, and cookies while still warm. It all looked delicious, but Billy remembered the bitter taste of the cookies the day before. I remembered Doc Harrison's words about small doses of poison. Victoria insisted that Billy taste each dish, watching his reactions carefully. His eyes shone with a strange intensity as he hesitated before eating. Billy pretended to enjoy the food, but discreetly poured small portions into the handkerchief he kept in his pocket. The conversation revolved around the preparations for the wedding. Victoria was talking about the honeymoon they had planned, about the trip they would take to the mountains after the ceremony. She described the secluded cabin where they would spend their first weeks as husband and wife, away from everyone, just the two of them. Billy felt a shiver as he imagined himself alone with Victoria in that distant place, far from witnesses, far from any help, the perfect scenario for a third unfortunate accident. He began to understand the pattern. Victoria would get married, take her husband to a secluded location, and then return alone, richer and freer to hunt down the next victim. When Victoria finally left, Billy ran into the bedroom and poured the contents of the handkerchief out the window. The food scraps fell into the backyard, where two stray cats soon showed up to investigate. Billy watched in horror as the animals began to writhe in convulsions minutes after eating. The night arrived loaded with revelations and difficult decisions. Billy knew he couldn't just run away from the city. Sheriff Matthews would carry out his threat, and he would be pursued like a criminal. But marrying Victoria meant a death sentence. He needed hard evidence, something he could use to expose Victoria and get rid of Matthews' blackmail. Billy decided that he would have to enter the Hartwell house and look for evidence of what he suspected. It was risky, but it was the only chance I had. The clock on the wall struck midnight when Billy left the boarding house through the back window. The moon was new, leaving the streets in almost total darkness. He knew every corner of Cedar Falls, every alley, every shortcut. If he could get into Victoria's house without being seen, he might find the answers he needed. The great white house seemed even larger in the darkness, like a sleeping monster waiting to devour anyone who approached. Billy took a deep breath and began to move toward the back of the property, where he knew there was a kitchen door that used to be unlocked. The night wind carried the smell of the desert and something else, the sweet, cloying aroma of withered flowers. Billy wondered how many secrets that house kept in its quiet rooms, how many truths were hidden within its elegant walls. Some truths can only be discovered in darkness, when the shadows reveal what the daylight carefully hides. Billy discovered this by forcing the lock on Victoria Hartwell's kitchen door. His fingers trembling not only from the early morning cold, the house was plunged into absolute silence. Each floorboard seemed to amplify the sound of his cautious footsteps as Billy moved through the kitchen toward the other rooms. The lavender scent he'd smelled during the day was stronger now, mixed with something chemical that made his eyes sting. Billy found Victoria's office on the first floor. The door was locked, but the key rested on the frame, as if she didn't expect unwanted visitors. The room was smaller than Billy had imagined, dominated by a mahogany desk and bookshelves filled with books on medicine, chemistry, and botany. The light of the lantern revealed an impressive collection of volumes on poisonous plants, ancient medical treatises, and pharmacy manuals. Billy flipped through some of the books, finding marked pages, notes in the margins, passages underlined with red ink. Victoria had studied her deadly craft with the dedication of an academic. A locked drawer on the desk caught his eye. Billy forced the lock with a knife he found in the kitchen, the metal creaking against metal in the silence of the night. Inside, he discovered a diary bound in red leather, along with several small jars containing substances he could not identify. The pages of the diary revealed a calculating and cold mind. Victoria had documented every step of her previous crimes with scientific precision. Doses administered, symptoms observed, reactions of husbands, all noted in an elegant handwriting that contrasted with the horrific nature of the contents. James, her first husband, had been poisoned gradually over the course of 3 months. Victoria had tested different amounts of arsenic mixed with food, adjusting doses as symptoms manifested. She described his agony with the coldness of someone who observes a scientific experiment. Robert, the second husband, had received a different treatment. Victoria had discovered a local plant that, when dried and ground, caused seizures and cardiac arrest. She had mixed the powder into the herbs that Robert used to make tea. The man had died believing he had suffered a heart attack. Billy felt nauseous as he read the plans Victoria had made for him. She intended to use a combination of both poisons during her honeymoon in the mountains. First, small doses of arsenic to weaken it, then the poisonous plant to simulate a fatal accident. She had already chosen the place where she would leave the body, near a cliff where accidents were common. Most disturbing were Victoria's motivations. It wasn't just greed. It described a sense of power, of absolute control over the life and death of other human beings. Husbands were just cogs in a macabre game she played with herself, challenges that made her existence interesting. Billy also found correspondence between Victoria and a man named Nathaniel Cross, who lived in a nearby town. The letters revealed that Victoria was not the only one involved in this scheme. Cross provided information about wealthy widowers in other locations, and Victoria reciprocated with details about his poisoning techniques. A network of murders stretched across several cities in the territory. Victoria was just one cog in a larger organization dedicated to hunting down lonely and vulnerable people to steal their fortunes. Billy understood that even if he managed to expose Victoria, there would still be others like her scattered around the region. A noise upstairs made Billy freeze. Slow, deliberate footsteps moved down the hallway above his head. Victoria had woken up, or perhaps had never slept. Billy quickly extinguished the flashlight and crouched behind the desk, his heart beating so loudly that it seemed to echo through the walls. The footsteps descended the main stairs. Billy heard Victoria moving around the living room, then the kitchen. She had discovered the door broken into. A dim light began to move around the house as Victoria searched for him, probably carrying a candle or lantern. Billy knew he didn't have much time. He quickly tore out some of the most incriminating pages of the diary and folded them, hiding them inside his shirt. He also took one of the poison vials as evidence. Every movement seemed to produce a deafening noise in the tense silence of the house. Victoria's light was approaching the office. Billy moved toward the window, forcing it to open without making a sound. The first floor was not very high, and there was a sturdy vine covering the outer wall. He began to descend when he heard Victoria enter the office. The cry of anger she let out when she discovered the violated diary echoed through the silent night. Billy let himself drop the last few meters to the ground and ran towards the street. Hearing Victoria shout his name through the windows of the house, she knew who had trespassed on her property, and that meant he was in mortal danger. Billy did not return to the boarding house. Instead, he ran to the church downtown, where he knew Father Murphy slept in the back. If he was going to die, at least he would leave the evidence with someone he trusted, someone who could tell the truth in case something happened to him. The dawn was coming to an end when Billy knocked on the back door of the church. Father Murphy appeared in a bathrobe, his hair unkempt and his expression sleepy that quickly turned to concern at the sight of Billy's condition. Billy handed the diary pages and the vial of poison to the priest, quickly explaining what he had discovered. Murphy examined the evidence with growing horror, his face turning pale as he grasped the magnitude of Victoria's crimes. The sun was rising when Billy finally left the church. He knew that Victoria must have already gone to Sheriff Matthews, making up some story about being attacked or threatened. The wedding was still scheduled for the next day, and Billy had to decide whether to flee the city or confront Victoria publicly. But now, he was no longer alone. Father Murphy had promised to take the evidence to the federal judge, who would visit the city the following week. Victoria Hartwell would finally pay for her crimes, even if Billy didn't live to see it happen. The morning wind carried the smell of the approaching rain. A storm was coming to Cedar Falls, and Billy knew that when it passed, the town would never be the same. Justice in the Wild West has always come in unexpected ways, and that Saturday morning it arrived with the sound of hooves pounding on dry land. Billy woke up to the noise of horsemen approaching Cedar Falls, an entourage that was not expected, but that would change everything. Federal Judge Marcus Reed had brought forward his visit by a week. Accompanied by 3 armed marshals, he entered the city when the sun had barely risen. Father Murphy was waiting for him at the door of the church, carrying the evidence that Billy had torn from Victoria's house the previous morning. Billy watched from the boarding house window as the judge examined the diary pages and the poison vial. Even from a distance, she could see how the man's face twitched in disgust as she read the details of the murders Victoria had documented. The marshals talked quietly, their hands resting naturally on their weapons. Victoria appeared on Main Street dressed as a bride. The white dress contrasted eerily with the cold expression in her eyes when she saw the federal entourage gathered in front of the church. She stopped in the middle of the street like a predatory animal that suddenly realizes it has fallen into a trap. Sheriff Matthews walked out of the precinct trying to maintain his authority in front of federal visitors. But when Judge Reed showed the evidence and explained the charges against Victoria, the sheriff visibly paled. He immediately understood that his blackmail scheme had collapsed along with his partner's crimes. Victoria tried to run. She lifted the skirt of her wedding dress and darted toward the back of the city, where she kept a saddled horse. But the marshals were prepared. Two of them intercepted her before she could reach the mount, knocking her to the dusty ground of the street. The people of Cedar Falls gathered to watch the arrest. Many seemed genuinely shocked by the revelations about Victoria, but some faces showed quiet relief, as if old suspicions had finally found confirmation. Matthews tried to negotiate, offering information about other crimes in exchange for clemency. But Judge Reed was not interested in plea bargaining. The evidence against the sheriff for blackmail and complicity was clear enough. He was arrested along with Victoria, the handcuffs making noise as they were placed on his wrists. Billy left the boarding house when it was all over. Judge Reed greeted him with a firm handshake and a few words of recognition for his courage. The accusations of cheating in the game were considered insignificant in the face of the magnitude of the crimes Billy had helped expose. Victoria was put in the prison wagon, but before she left, she looked directly at Billy. There was no anger in his eyes, just a cold curiosity, as if she was wondering how he had discovered his secrets. Even defeated, she kept the same calculating expression she had used when offering poisoned cookies. The midday sun illuminated Cedar Falls as the federal motorcade departed carrying the prisoners. The town became eerily quiet after they disappeared onto the dusty road. People returned to their homes and businesses, but everyone knew that something had changed forever. Billy walked to the large white house that had belonged to Victoria. The iron gate was open, swaying slowly in the hot wind. The property would be auctioned off by the federal government, and the money used to compensate victims' families in other cities. That night, Billy dined at the saloon for the first time in weeks. The other men in the city greeted him with renewed respect, recognizing in him someone who had faced evil and emerged victorious. But Billy knew that victory had a bitter taste when you think of all the lives that could have been saved if someone had acted sooner. Doc Harrison approached the table where Billy was drinking his beer. The old doctor looked 10 years younger, as if a terrible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't say much, just touched Billy's shoulder in a gesture of silent gratitude. A few weeks later, Billy received a letter from Judge Reed informing him that Victoria had been sentenced to death and that the network of assassins had been dismantled. Nathaniel Cross and other accomplices were captured in nearby towns, ending a cycle of crimes that had lasted for years. Billy continued to live in Cedar Falls. The city was his home, and he had learned that running away from problems was never the real solution. Instead, he decided to stay and help rebuild the trust that had been shattered by the events of the past few months. The desert wind was still blowing through the dusty streets, but now it carried with it the promise of better days. Justice had prevailed, not through violence or revenge, but through the courage of a man who refused to accept a fate that others had chosen for him. Did you like this story of suspense and mystery of the Wild West? Subscribe to the channel for more fascinating Western stories that will hold your attention from start to finish.